Welcome to our conference on animal consciousness. That's not going to keep going for the whole conference, is it? Hi out there to anyone on the live stream. There's still a fair amount of room here if you want to come by. So this conference is a production of the NYU Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, the Center for Bioethics, and the Animal Studies Initiative. I'm David Chalmers, the co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, along with Ned Block. The Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness was set up here at NYU about 4 or 5 years ago with a brief to study foundational issues in the mind-brain sciences. And as part of that, we organize a series of debates, events, research programs, but also a major annual conference. So some of you were along last year at our conference on the ethics of artificial intelligence. The year before, there was one on Is the Brain Bayesian? Before that, there was one on brain mapping initiatives and measuring borderline states of consciousness. But this year, it's on the subject of animal consciousness. I think a topic of really a lot of current and ongoing interest. We're joined this year by the Center for Bioethics, with whom we've organized events in the past, directed by Matthew Lau, who's co-organized the conference. They're set up, they've been studying all kinds of relevant ethical issues that arise from biology and from technology, with a lot of connection to these issues about animals. And for the first time this year, we're joined by the Animal Studies Initiative, represented here by Del Jamieson, who's also co-organizing the conference. The Animal Studies Initiative is part of the Department of Environmental Sciences at NYU, engaged in all kinds of interesting issues to do with animals. They've just now set up an MA program, which will be starting next fall, and right now admitting students for the first time in the ongoing graduate admissions process. Dale will probably get up here this afternoon and say a few words about that MA program for any of you who may be interested. We're very grateful to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at NYU for all their support of these initiatives and these events, as well as the College of Global Public Health, which runs the Center for, which houses the Center for Bioethics, for all their support. We're also grateful to the Cantor Film Center and to all of our amazing administrators, helpers, organizers, John Simon, Cassie Cost from Bioethics, and a whole army of grad students and postdocs who are helping out. So thanks to all of you. So our topic here is animal consciousness, consciousness in animals. We've got an amazing program, I think, lined up for the next couple of days, going through issues about animals at many different levels of complexity, about many different philosophical and scientific issues that arise. The program, like all of the conferences we've organized, the program here is interdisciplinary. We've got philosophers, we've got scientists from many different areas on the agenda. Some of us, it's fair to say, come to animals from the study of consciousness. Some of us come to consciousness from the study of animals. Speaking for myself, it's very much in the direction of starting with consciousness, and those of us in the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness have been thinking about consciousness for many years, and of course, you can't escape the issue of the distribution of consciousness in animals and what kind of character consciousness might have in animals. Theories of consciousness have really been developed in in an extraordinary smorgasbord of theoretical options over the last few years, both within philosophy and within science. Some theories have come to be favored, and I think it's time to step back and look at what does the progress we've made on consciousness say about the question of animals, as well as taking the question of animals as a challenge point for any theory of consciousness. If you can't say something plausible, and well-grounded about consciousness in animals, there's going to be serious limits on your theory. So that's one direction, coming from consciousness to animals. I think many other people here are coming from animals to consciousness. We've got people here, both scientists and philosophers, who have thought about animals, issues about animals for many years, whether, say, issues about cognition and complex behavior in animals, or ethical issues about animals. And whether you're coming, say, from this scientific or ethical perspective on animals, issues about consciousness can soon become hard to avoid. Certainly, if you're thinking about animal cognition and animal behavior, the question inevitably arises, what kind of consciousness, what kind of subjective experience might be lying behind the relevant behavior or the relevant kinds of cognition? And I think a number of scientists have been increasingly turning to that question. If you're thinking about ethical issues about animals, something I know a lot of people here are very concerned about, and animal rights, what our appropriate duties are toward animals, to many people, the question of consciousness then becomes front and center. Many people think it's insofar as animals are conscious beings that they have some kind of moral status, and the question of whether different non-human animals are conscious and what kind of consciousness they may have is crucial to our ethical treatment of them. So I think there's at least some thought or some hope that a better understanding of animal consciousness might help us to get somewhat clearer on our ethical duties towards animals. So these are all issues we'll be exploring as the conference goes along. I mean, there are issues about which non-human animals are conscious. What is the distribution of consciousness in the domain of animals? When did consciousness first arise along an evolutionary timescale? That kind of issue will be, I think, a central focus this morning, so I'll say more about that in a moment. There will be issues about what kind of consciousness is found in different animals. Not so much about the existence of consciousness, but about the character of consciousness. Tom Nagel, famously back in 1974, wrote the article, "What is it like to be a bat?" About what can we know about the consciousness of an animal very different from ourselves, where are there limits on what we know? Well, in the meantime, many people have been working away on many different animal species. Over the course of this conference, perhaps we'll hear at least something about what is it like to be an octopus, what is it like to be a dog, what is it like to be a dolphin, and perhaps even what is it like to be a bee. So these are issues about the subjective character of consciousness. They raise many philosophical issues, epistemological issues. How can we know? Issues in the philosophy of science. What's the appropriate methodology for coming to study these questions about the character of consciousness? And then, of course, there are going to be ethical and associated political and legal issues about how does consciousness bear on our ethical duties towards animals. So I think over the course, and the question how does all this connect to theories of consciousness? How does thinking clearly about animals help us clarify our theories of consciousness, and how do theories of consciousness help us get straight on issues about animals? So over the course of the conference, we'll be looking at all of those questions over the next 5 sessions. I think our sessions are evolution, invertebrates, and early vertebrates. This morning, a special session on whether fish feel pain in the early afternoon, ethical issues in the late afternoon. Tomorrow morning, theories of consciousness meet animal consciousness. Tomorrow afternoon, emotion and self-consciousness in animals, and then a final panel discussion. I should say we're also having a reception, which is not on the program, this evening at 6 p.m. across the square at 40 Washington Square South, featuring special guest lecture from a local rapper known to some of you. Baba Brinkman, the author of the Rap Guide to Consciousness, will perform a couple of numbers. So you're all invited to that. Okay, I think it's just about 9:30. Time to get started. So I will now transition to introducing the first session. So the first session is on invertebrates, early vertebrates, and the evolution of consciousness. So issues about when and where did consciousness arise in evolution, and what kinds of consciousness can we expect to find in relatively simple organisms like invertebrates and simple vertebrates. I think this is in some ways, indicative of how the field and the orientation in this field has gradually transformed over the years. I mean, when it comes to questions about the distribution of consciousness, René Descartes famously thought, okay, humans only. Any non-human organism is not going to be conscious at all. And that view it's still out there that consciousness, maybe that consciousness requires language or something akin to it. But over the years, the attitudes towards the ascription of consciousness in both science and philosophy have liberalized. A few years ago, the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness was signed, which declared that consciousness is present in, I think it was all mammals, some birds, and octopuses. So octopuses get treated here as honorary vertebrates, and I think even under law in some places. And now, we're finding now that people are now prepared to at least countenance the idea of consciousness more and more broadly. So we'll have talk here on consciousness in insects, and so on. In the afternoon, we'll be thinking about fish. So that's where I think right now that's the locus of questions about which organisms are consciousness and where did it arise in evolution has gradually broadened to the point where we really can at least entertain these questions about consciousness in invertebrates and vertebrates, look at the evidence, and then think seriously about what this tells us or how this interfaces with issues about how consciousness evolved. And I think all of our speakers in this first session have thought about those issues and how they interact. What kind of consciousness you'll find in simple organisms, and how this interfaces with questions about evolution. So I think this is going to be a very exciting session because of that. 4 speakers coming at this topic in 4 different ways. Our first speaker is Peter Godfrey-Smith from the University of Sydney. Peter's done well-known, really interesting work in both the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of mind, really specializing in empirically grounded thought about cognition in human and non-human organisms. Many of you will know his recent book, Other Minds, which really focuses especially on the octopus and on consciousness in octopuses and what it may be like. It's been something of a bestseller, I gather, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend it to you. It's a wonderful book to read. Today, Peter's going to talk to us about animal evolution and subjective experience. So please welcome my first speaker, Peter Godfrey-Smith.
Okay, so what I'll do in this talk is give a sketch of animal evolution and some relevant phylogenetic relationships, then locate in that framework some features that seem likely to matter to subjective experience and talk about their history. Do these things arise once or often? Do they tend to cluster or dissociate? I'll then outline cautiously how I think everything might fit together, and lastly, I'll say something about the special case of the octopus. Okay, my title says subjective experience. The conference title says consciousness. These are often seen as the same, especially here at NYU. At least for one sense of the word consciousness. I think there's a little bit of a problem. I think consciousness inevitably suggests a rich human kind of subjective experience. And many discussions, especially around here, tend to set that aside. They say consciousness is just the fact of there being something it's like to be a particular kind of system, in Nagel's phrase. Okay, that's fine, But I think the richer associations tend to return moments after the weak sense has been endorsed and make the problem look harder. So I think subjective experience is a better word for the target, but I'm going to speak the local language here much of the time. Okay, the history of animals has the shape of a tree. Animals are a branch or a subtree within a larger tree of life, a structure which outside of animals is not so reliably tree-like. This tree-based framework I use here is not employed with any philosophical claim about the nature of species or anything like that. It just represents what happened. All present-day animals are linked by common ancestry to various degrees of temporal depth. So there's a first picture of the tree, and you read that with time running up the screen. It's very incomplete with respect to which groups are included, and it mixes taxonomic ranks, which is not a problem. But that gives you a first picture of the history. People still sometimes talk of a phylogenetic scale. They might ask, where in the phylogenetic scale did consciousness arise? There's no such thing as a phylogenetic scale. A scale is an ordering, a matter of higher and lower. In a tree like this, there is higher versus lower in the sense of earlier versus later, but no one alive now is lower in that sense. There's also a distinction between simple and complex, but there are many different kinds of complexity and no single scale. A tree is just a different kind of thing, and animals form or are part of a tree. Now, animals arose something like 700 to 900 million years ago, and I'll describe the sequence of branchings in a way organised by the relations between various present-day animals. So one early branching, down the bottom of the screen, led on one side to sponges, and on the other side to everyone or nearly everyone else. Later, a branching occurred that led on one side to cnidarians, jellyfish, corals, and anemones on one side, and bilaterians on the other. So bilaterians, or bilaterally symmetrical animals, are animals like us that have a left and right side as well as an up and down, and they include most of the familiar animals. Now, nervous systems may have evolved once or perhaps twice. Everybody, or nearly everybody, on the big branch that includes cnidarians and bilaterians has a nervous system. Sponges have no nervous systems. They're the only animals marked on the slide that have no nervous systems. The bilaterian line then splits into two sides. I have labelled the protostomes and the deuterostomes. We are deuterostomes, as are starfish. Protostomes include most of the familiar invertebrates, insects, crustaceans, which are both arthropods, mollusks, various kinds of worms, and they also form two big branches. I've marked there also a particular animal, the bilaterian last common ancestor, as a particular important stage in the history of animal life. Now, many of the branchings mentioned so far took place in the Ediacaran, the first period with any fossil record of animals, 635 to 540 million years ago. There's a reconstruction of Ediacaran life by the English artist John Sibbick. This was a time of ambiguous forms, many of which lived fixed in place or drifted, while a few others probably crawled, grazing microbial mats. Then we reach the Cambrian explosion from 540 million years or so ago, which sees the sudden appearance of bodies with hard parts and obvious means for complex behaviour: legs, claws, and sophisticated eyes. Now, three groups which diverged in the Ediacaran, that's the orange band at the bottom of the screen, eventually produced some species showing conspicuous behavioural complexity. The three groups are arthropods, especially some insects, spiders and crabs, vertebrates like us, and a particular group of mollusks called cephalopods, especially the octopus. So as you can see, those groups diverged early in the Ediacaran and evolved behavioural complexity later and independently. As Michael Tressman has put it, these three groups contain species with complex active bodies, animals with the capacity for rapid and directed movement, manipulation of objects, and sensory tracking of objects in space. They also have complex nervous systems that enable this. So we can start by recognising three origins for complex behaviour and large nervous systems, though it's possible to split more finely. And these animals all seem like initial candidates in some sense for subjective experience. But we've not said enough, surely, to make much of a link to that question yet. There's not been much bridging of the gap. So next we can start looking for some more specific features. Well, the point that we would get from a huge amount of recent work is look at the sensory side. For many thinkers, subjective experience is either inherently sensory or this is the paradigm case. For some people, this claim goes via a representationalist view of qualia, but other views have a similar sensory focus without that. Now, sensing of some sort is ubiquitous, not just in animals, but in all known cellular life. But there are differences in complexity that might be relevant. So what I'll do here is just look at the particular case of vision, a sense with unique importance in animal evolution. So which kinds of animals have eyes that can form a usable image and, with the aid of downstream processing, present objects in space? You might think that that is an important feature in the evolution of subjective experience. Well, Dan Erik Nielsen discusses 4 classes of eyes, 1 to 4, with class 4 being high resolution, eyes that enable high resolution vision. Those eyes evolved perhaps 3 to 4 times with 2 different designs: the camera eye of vertebrates and cephalopods and the compound eye of arthropods. So the groups in which these eyes arose are the same 3 groups that were picked out earlier more generally. Now myself, I don't think that perception is the key to subjective experience. In arguing that there is non-sensory conscious experience, people often use cases like moods and also cognitive phenomenology, the experience of thinking or remembering things. Now I agree with both sets of arguments. I had the example in my Jack Smart lecture of energy level, fatigue and its relatives to the list. I think not all subjective experience is presentation of facts or things. There's also just a way that some internal states and processes feel. Now, there's a family of approaches that look beyond sensing in a particular way. They start from the idea that a plausible early form of consciousness is evaluative or affective. Feelings, especially washes of positive and negative affect, might be basic and widespread forms of subjective experience. Now, valuing, like sensing, in some form is ubiquitous, but there might be some forms with special relevance to the problem. An idea that's been picked up by various people is a possible link between consciousness and instrumental learning, which is learning by tracking the good and bad consequences of your actions. There are other kinds of evaluative sophistication that include especially trade-offs, as seen in Robert Elwood's well-known work on hermit crabs, but I'll make my next point just with the aid of learning itself. Now, instrumental learning appears to be scattered through the animal tree in a way that suggests it involved several times. It's present in vertebrates and cephalopods and some arthropods, very prominent in bees. But it has not yet been seen in all arthropods, including some behaviourally complex ones, such as wasps and spiders. Spiders are occasionally said to show instrumental learning, but I think the standard citation given there is generally misdescribed and does not support this. Now, this raises the possibility of a dissociation between features relevant to subjective experience. I think we can imagine, at least in principle, an animal with a very sophisticated sensory side and much simpler evaluation, an animal that's sort of more robotic on the evaluative side. And then we can also imagine the flip side. Perhaps an animal with less of an idea of what's going on around it, but with a stronger sense of whether what's going on is good or bad. Now, is that second option harder to make sense of? The possible asymmetry there is reflected, I think, in possible facts about distribution. For the first combination, rich sensing and simpler evaluation, we have various terrestrial arthropods, and the combination makes sense there. Arthropods that live on land often have short lives dominated by routine, by a definite and restricted set of actions. Complex actions, but regimented ones. They don't live very open lives, but they face considerable sensory motor demands, especially the ones that can fly. On the other side, rich evaluation, simpler sensing, there are no cases, I think, that are as clear, but perhaps gastropods, the group that includes slugs and snails. They can do at least some instrumental learning, but they have much simpler eyes than other such learners. So there's a summary slide, very tentative for this part of the treatment. The slide has purple for complexity on both the evaluative and the sensory sides, blue for the sensory side only, red for the evaluative side only. I think the colours are coming through okay. Now, if there's a problem with this slide, I think it's one of making the gulfs wider than they really are. One thing it illustrates in principle, though, is the possibility of different evolutionary paths to things that are different from each other, but each of which would amount or might amount to a form of subjective experience. Or perhaps less starkly, there might be at least paths which are with a much redder or bluer tinge. Now, I'll leave that slide up there and then press to a still finer grain of analysis. From here, there are further traits, with somewhat more ambiguous role in some ways, that might be still better as bridging traits with respect to the mental and the physical. One is integration of the senses to yield a multimodal model of the world. Relatedly, there's integration of sensory input and the present state of the body, and integration of what you're sensing with which actions you take as an animal to be underway. Through the evolution, especially of traits of that last couple of kinds, an animal becomes a centre of action and perception in a way that is not true of other living things. And one consequence of becoming a centre of agency and perception of this kind is the animal's gaining a sense of itself as such a thing. As emphasised by Bjorn Merker, a mobile animal is continually generating by its own actions sensory inputs that must be disambiguated, that must be registered as self-caused rather than being informative about external changes. As another Bjorn Brems has also noted, instrumental learning requires something of the same kind. The animal must register what it's doing or has just done, as opposed to what has merely happened. So competent agency in a mobile animal that can actively manipulate objects requires some registration, perhaps tacit, of that animal's own agency. Now, of the things that I've put on the table now, complex sensing, complex evaluation, integration, registration of one's own agency, I am not sure how they fit together biologically or which are the most important to the problems at hand, which ones are more or less incidental to the problem, which ones are less so. I'm also not sure how deep the differences in style might be, the sorts of differences put on a slide like that. But suppose we had a filled out theory of this general kind, what contribution would it make? I think a theory like this, when filled out, would be a theory of subjectivity. I think of that as the right bridging concept here. Once we have an animal with all that in some appropriate combination, we have the activities of a subject. Subjective experience is some of what goes on in systems of that kind. It's part of what they undergo. Now, some bits of standard descriptions of the problem encourage this kind of bridging. So Nagel says in a couple of places that the main problem here is explaining in naturalistic terms how a subjective point of view could come to be part of a material world. And that's exactly what a theory of this kind would give us. Subjective experience is the biology of subjectivity from the subject's point of view. And subjects, in turn, are comprehensible evolutionary products. Now, to fill this out a little in the last few minutes, I'll make some comments about how a theory with this general shape relates to some other lines of argument that might seem to push away from the sort of story being told here, and might also seem to push away from the existence of subjective experience in animals far from us. So this is work that might be taken to suggest it's not right that subjective experience is basically just the first-person point of view on what complex animals do. Now, one message of that sort is taken from current research on the human side, and this can be described as argument for a kind of selectivity. So Dehane and Milner and Goodale would be good names to mention in this connection. The argument is that lots of what we do, including quite complicated things, is not conscious. And these things seem to include a lot of the basic activity of getting by, perception, some basic kinds of learning, and the guidance of action. We humans seem to do lots of that in the dark, and those activities might seem to include a lot of what other animals get up to. So an argument that might be given, and I don't know if this has been made explicitly or if it's really a sort of tacit argument, is something like this. Because we can do a lot of basic activities unconsciously, taken together, this might suggest that it's possible to have an entire behavioural profile of the sort seen in animals that is unconscious. But that would not follow. It might be true, but it does not follow. In the human experiments that motivate this view, the subjects are conscious, though they may not be conscious of everything they do. There's no reason for this kind of work to think that because at any time some of what we do is done unconsciously, that it could be all that way at once. It might instead be that once you are an awake human subject doing the usual sort of stuff, some of it has to be conscious. And this point can apply even setting aside the sorts of high attention, temporally demanding tasks of the sort emphasised by de Haene that seem to never be done unconsciously. Okay, I'm going to skip the second one for time, which involves an argument due to Hakwon Lau. Another challenge that I'll discuss more briefly could be seen not as a challenge to the argument, but as a challenge to us. So I discussed a range of subjectivity relevant properties, properties that look like partial gap closures in different ways. These all have simpler forms, running over the tree of animal life and outside of animals to some degree. So if these features are subjectivity relevant in general, is that only true of their complex forms, or is it true of all forms? Now, I don't know. To me, though, it does appear that the closer we look on the biological side, the more graded the relevant properties are turning out to be. So those sensory and evaluative transitions I discussed earlier, class 4 eyes, instrumental learning, these are all surrounded by various sorts of close approaches, near misses, and partial cases. Now, this leaves open the possibility that there is some reason why only some values of those variables, only complex forms, are even relevant to subjective experience. I don't see that, but I don't think we know it to be true or false. A true gradualism about subjective experience is both the more difficult option to think about, but I think given our empirical picture, also the more natural option, the one that makes more sense. If so, we would have to move beyond an account of which features might suffice to make an animal an experiencing subject, to an account of how having richer versions of those features implies internal goings-on that are more rather than less experiential. We have to describe things in something like that form. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit to make sure I don't lose my octopuses at the end. I'll think just a little bit about the special case of the octopus. I think of this as the sort of flagship case for an argument about multiple independent origins of subjective experience. I think that most likely some arthropods do have subjective experience. There's something it's like to be a crab and probably something it's like to be a bee, but the octopus is the kind of stronger case. It's the most neurally complex invertebrate with something like 500 million neurons. Octopuses firstly have all the basics I've discussed here. On both sensory and evaluative sides. They have class 4 eyes, instrumental learning, they engage in wound tending. They also have some of the extras, a style of cognition that is suggestive of the phenomena discussed in workspace theories and the like. Not suggestive of there being a special place inside the animal, a workspace, but suggestive of the sort of attention-driven, novelty-directed way of being that workspace theorists associate with consciousness. Now, I think octopus smartness is sometimes exaggerated. They're not ruminative animals, but they have an exploratory style of behaviour, continually manipulating objects in novel ways. Their nervous systems are rather decentralised, with most neurons in the arms themselves, and that's relevant to questions about integration and the generation of a self, but they can often pull themselves together and act as attentive, evaluating subjects with rather chaotic mixes of curiosity and action. Try that again. I want to play a video. Okay, to finish, here is a video to show some of the complexity of what they get up to. The video was taken in special circumstances at Octopus, a site where densities are very high and octopuses have to deal with each other a lot more than usual. I like the video because it shows this sort of continual shifts of attention, different modes of behaviour. I like it also because we have another subject, a closer relative of us, present as well, a pufferfish observing the scene for its own mysterious reasons. It looks to me a little bit like a naturalist, and I have to admit it reminds me of David Attenborough. As the pufferfish watches, this octopus produces a display which we call the Nosferatu display, named after the movie Vampire of that name. This is a display which appears to signal aggressive intent, as it has spied two other octopuses coming into its area from outside. It zooms off towards them under jet propulsion, maintaining its dark colour, while they produce a characteristic paler colour that we find associated with less aggressive, more submissive behaviours. And then the octopus returns eventually to its den under the watchful eye of the naturalistic pufferfish. Now, one thing you might be wondering at this point is what happens if the pufferfish gets too close? I won't show video, I'll just show a couple of screenshots from a recent video of this. Peril for Sir David. One of the good parts of his story is that neither pufferfish nor octopus was harmed in the making of this video, but it is nonetheless a reminder of the risks attendant on close observation of complex animals.
Okay, so the way this works is the talks are all 20 minutes. We'll take 10 minutes for a Q&A after each talk, and then at the end of the session, we'll have some remaining time to get everyone on stage with some group discussion. But questions for Peter? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Peter. I wondered what you thought of the idea that maybe a more interesting question than which kinds of animals have consciousness here is actually what it's like to be these different animals, whether or not they're conscious or not.
I agree, it's an interesting question. In 20-odd minutes, it becomes a challenge, given that I wanted to cover the whole evolutionary story. But I think in the case of octopuses, I think you can start to imagine what it might be like to be an octopus. The sensory world of these animals is in some ways very familiar, in some ways very unfamiliar. They're very visual animals. They have an image-forming eye a lot like ours. But everything they touch with their arms is being tasted as well as touched in our sense. The body can form pretty much any shape at all. So it's a body that is, and probably forms various shapes without the central brain sort of supervising that much what the arms are doing. So you're in the world in a way that it involves a combination of rich and, probably not utterly alien visual information, but a very different way of being in contact with objects around you, which involves a kind of taste and this indefinite flexibility of the body. It also appears that octopuses may have some light sensitivity across all of their skin. Not that you could see with your skin, but there might be sort of washes of input from the play of higher and lower intensities of light on the skin. So I think when we say things like that, we're obviously saying things pretty quickly and speculatively, but it's not that there's something preventing us from making some steps forward and working out what it might be like to be this animal.
Thanks. Yeah, so one more over there.
Thank you. Excellent talk. You have a paper on mind, matter, and metabolism, and I'm intrigued by Eric Chesson's work, where he calculates energy density flow, ergs per second per gram, as a rough measurement of complexity. And I'm just wondering, is there a corresponding increase in the metabolic rate of these species that exhibit subjectivity? Does the metabolism increase? Is it a cause or a consequence the subjectivity that they experience?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd be cautious about readily believing in too direct a connection there. So if I take the case of crabs. So Robert Elwood's work suggests that crabs are evaluatively rich animals. They can make a sort of distinction between things going well or badly for themselves in a way that seems highly relevant to questions of subjective experience. Now, my understanding is that animals like crabs are not animals with a kind of rampant metabolism. They're rather low energy animals in a sort of general sense. Andrew might have more to say about this or might know more about this than I do. But for reasons like that, I would not reject such an idea out of hand, but would treat it with a little bit of caution.
I was wondering if you think it's a necessary condition for an animal to have a central nervous system, to have a subjective experience. Because, for example, when we are thinking about some Nigerians or like scallops that can escape their predators, are we 100% sure that they cannot have a subjective experience?
Cases where you have a nervous system but not a central nervous system, I mean, that's exactly the place where, so I say some general things about the need to move to a more gradualist picture in this talk. And in some sorts of cases, I think, well, yes, that's a sort of very natural thing to do. When you raise animals that have a nervous system but with a great deal of decentralization, and I sort of feel the pressure of the case. And part of it, I think, is just the difficulty we have in thinking about in a genuinely gradualist way about questions like this. Is it the case, so for example, the most behaviorally complex animal with no centralization of the nervous system at all is probably the terrifying box jellyfish, which has pretty decent eyes, can navigate, and so on. So it acts like a sort of coherent animal agent for certain purposes, does have a nervous system, and I think there are no candidates that put pressure on the kind of picture I'm presenting that don't have a nervous system. But it's a case where the nervous system has no centralization. That's exactly the case where I probably should just, I don't think we know how to think about cases like that very well yet. Because on the one hand, they have a kind of behavioral competence that's not too far from the sort that in other cases would suggest there's a very minimal kind of subjectivity present. On the architectural side, it looks a little weird to say that.
Okay, time for one more quick question. Maybe just pass the mic a couple rows back.
So we certainly do have to fight for the mic. I'm really interested in the case of wasps and spiders. So my understanding, for example, the cricket has efferent's copy, and they have complex sensors, and the spiders have complex mobile abilities, and yet they don't operantly condition, you said. So how do you explain the spiders and the wasps? Spiders build webs, for example. It's just puzzling to me that it seems to undermine the argument.
I'm glad wasps and spiders exist because they're the best cases of what seems to be a comprehensible separation between two subjectivity relevant features. So if you're a wasp, you have to fly, and flying is an incredibly demanding thing with respect to the sensory motor side. But if you're a wasp, you also have a life which is short, which is dominated by routine. There's a certain number of behaviors you have to get through. There's not much openness. There's not much capacity to sort of do something different from the other wasps and do so successfully if you're a wasp. So given that you have natural selection miniaturizing the brain, I think it makes a certain amount of sense that what you would end up with is an animal that has a rich sensory motor capacity. The presentation of objects may have things like perceptual constancies, which people like Burge think are very important to genuine representation, and that might in turn be taken as relevant to a certain kind of subjectivity. But there's just no reason to have evaluative sophistication because your life is so short and so routinized. Crabs have much longer lives than animals like wasps. Marine arthropods tend to live longer and have less of a kind of, I've got to get this done by 5 o'clock tomorrow or I'm dead, in the way that a wasp life tends to have. So I think of this as a kind of, probably the best case for showing the possible separability of properties that each are subjectivity relevant, which in us are present together, but which might be dissociated in some cases.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Okay, our next speaker is Todd Feinberg. Todd is actually a psychiatrist by training in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurology at Mount Sinai, who's written a number of books over the years about consciousness in humans and the self, really interesting books, but has also had an abiding interest in the evolution of consciousness, to the point where recently he co-authored a book with John Mallett on the ancient origins of consciousness, all about the evolution of consciousness. It's really had quite a degree of uptake and influence. So today, Todd will talk to us about the ancient evolutionary origins of consciousness. Please welcome Todd Feinberg.
So I arrived here yesterday from Beth Israel, and I decided to relax, watch some television. First thing I put on, Planet of the Apes. And it was the bad ape that was on. Okay, so I didn't know if that was a omen, good or bad, but nonetheless, at least it wasn't SpongeBob SquarePants. How did I get to this podium today? My career has been mainly involved with the study of humans, human consciousness, perturbations of the self in patients with brain lesions, stroke, traumatic brain injury, callosal lesions, alien hand syndrome. But all throughout, I've been fascinated by the question of subjectivity and consciousness and where does it come from. Read a huge amount of philosophy on this, trying to figure out the origins of subjectivity. I was always interested in brain evolution, trying to drill down how far back can we go in the complexity of a brain to create what we call subjectivity. Now, subjectivity, even though it is related to consciousness, the two are used not identically. In my opinion, as I agree with Peter, that subjectivity is the real challenge. So, pushing back, I got down to an organism known as Amphioxus, which is a lancelet, and I said, is this little guy conscious or not? Would I ascribe subjectivity to this animal? Looked at its nervous system, started to work on the transition from Amphioxus and beyond, and we believe, John and I, and then I teamed up with John Mallett, who's an evolutionary biologist, and looked at that transition between that animal and, for example, something like a lamprey eel as the transitional form where we could say with good likelihood that that animal is conscious, whereas the other isn't. With the goal being, if we could identify the neurobiological factors that accounted for that transition, we would find the basis of subjectivity. That, overall, is the thrust of what this project is about. This slide is perhaps, in certain respects, the most important slide. Because what we're trying to indicate here is that in order to address this problem, we need to look at it from multiple perspectives. If you want to decide what is it like to be a bat, or is there something it's like to be a bat, you must read the philosophy to understand what that question entails. Yet at the same time, it must be informed by the neurobiology of nervous systems, the evolutionary aspects of how consciousness or subjectivity came into being, and using extant animals as proxies for this evolutionary development, as well as understanding the underlying neurobiology and behavior. The goal was to integrate, synthesize these factors to emerge with a unification or a synthetic theory that could account for all of these aspects. Okay, as we just saw, how do we decide what animals are conscious or what animals have subjectivity? Whether it's their subjectivity or our subjectivity, there's no question a fish does not have the same subjectivity as a chimp. I don't think anybody would make that argument. I don't think chimps have the same subjectivity as we do. Certainly, we don't have the same subjectivity as a fish. That does not disqualify a fish or a lamprey eel from having subjectivity. It depends upon your criteria and what you mean by it. Okay, now the most basic forms of experience, our targets are, let me get my glasses on here. This goes by various names. Perceptual consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, primary consciousness, sensory consciousness, they all are pretty much the same idea, with the emphasis in our work on the sensory aspects of it, or the perception. This is the aspect of consciousness that's most related to what Nagel called something it is like to be, which we've already heard about. Now, this is a point in which you see the intersection between the philosophy and the biology. Levine, in a classic paper, spoke about the explanatory gap between the objective brain and subjective experience. And that gap is what we have since the time of Descartes, trying to close, or at least bridge, or at least explain. But this is critical to determining what animals have subjective experience. Because if an animal's got that gap, at least according to my view, if the animal has that gap, it's got subjective experience. That's the way I look at it. Now, John Searle spoke about subjective awareness as being ontologically subjective, in other words, irreducibly, ontologically personal to the animal, to the being. This I agree with, and I will try to explain in the end how this works. Finally, David spoke about the hard problem of consciousness, in which explaining subjective experience, I think you would agree, is critical or central to the whole project. Well, things always got a little more complicated the deeper you look into them. And it turns out that there are at least 4 gaps between subjective experience, or the first-person experience, and the third-person viewer. One is referral. This applies mainly to exteroceptive awareness, awareness of the world, whereas mental images or mental representations are referred or projected into the environment. Sherrington called that projitions. Unity, binding. Experience tends to be unified, not totally, tends to be unified, certainly more unified than observation of the visible individual neurons in the brain. Causation. How can one's subjective experience, if it's not material, affect the world, affect things outside of it? Qualia. Now, qualia is king. Qualia, when you get right down to it, if you can explain sensory experience and how things feel, why things have feeling, how can objective material neurons produce experience and feeling, if you understood that, you're basically game over. Okay, now, again, things get a little more complicated. It turns out that qualitative experience has a diversity of neurobiological bases. It's not just one thing, which is a dumbfounding kind of problem. Because basically in neurology, we're used to the brain having a particular etiology for a particular problem. Okay? If you want to know how epilepsy happens, we have an answer. When it comes to subjectivity, it turns out that there's a diversity of material or neurobiological bases among, across, within even individual brains. So when you're talking about cross-species differences, right away, that octopus, I can tell you, if you look at that brain, it is so different than what we see in a human or in a primate or a vertebrate. However, what we will see, I hope to show, although I won't go into it in that much detail on the cephalopods, is that there are some common factors that can account for or play a role in creating subjectivity both across species and within brains. Okay. Exteroceptive sensory consciousness, awareness of the world. This is often taken to be the prototypical form of awareness. Okay. Christoph Koch, Tononi, Francis Crick and Koch focused exclusively on this. Gerald Edelman was mainly interested in the perception and sensory experiences of the world and how that translates from the brain to consciousness. Affective consciousness is called sentience. Those are global emotional states. This is the domain of Tony Damasio, Joe Ledoux, I don't know if Joe is here, Jaak Panskep. Interestingly enough, that is also sometimes taken as the prototypical form of consciousness. But believe me, these two are very different, but they both have qualia. Interoceptive consciousness. Here's another aspect, which is these are internal drives based upon internal motivated states, and this includes pain, which we're going to be hearing a lot about later on in this conference. Pain is sometimes taken as a prototypical form of consciousness, but its neurobiology is very different from, say, the redness of the apple or the smell of the coffee. Everyone's got their favorite qualia. I love when I read these because everyone's got coffee. Coffee seems to be like the number one qualia for some reason. The taste of coffee in my mouth. I mean, I don't know why that is said so many times, but it happens all the time. And the redness of red. You know, that's another good one. All types of qualia and explanatory gaps all have subjectivity. So these, even though they have diverse neurobiologies, they all have qualia in common. As I said, they are diverse both within, their neurobiology is diverse both within and across species. Okay, we take a multidisciplinary approach, as I showed you on our first slide, and our primary targets are exteroceptive sensory images and affects. We use a comparative neurobiological approach that looks at these within brains, so within an individual brain, what's happening when I see versus when I feel. And we look at it as well by behavioral criteria. What can the animal do? How does the animal respond? How would we infer subjectivity in the animal's brain? Okay, let's take first a look at exteroceptive sensory consciousness. This is awareness of the environment, touch, vision, audition, smell. They are referred. In other words, you don't feel a visual stimulus on your retina. You don't go, it's out there, okay? As a matter of fact, you cannot feel red on your retina, or you cannot feel red in your brain. You can only feel it as a projective sense. These involve various types of sensory maps. They go by various names. Vision is visuotopic. Your sense of touch is somatotopic, but there are also chemosenses like olfaction and gustation that create what we call isomorphic maps. And Butler calls them isomorphic maps. So they're mapped. They have some features in common with somatotopic maps, but they're not strictly mapped in terms of the environment. Somatotopic is mapped on your body. visual topic is mapped in the visual world. Okay, so the classic ones, for example, are isomorphic sensory. So somatotopic is the classic sort of one everybody knows about, where you have a homunculus in your brain that has a map representation of the spatial aspects of your body. It's projected onto that surface, and then it's experienced as a map. So that's very classically a somatotopic. Visual topic is the same way. Okay? You can see it very clearly in the star-nosed mole, where he's got these, what do they call those, tentacles or appendages, and they map, each one of those has a little space in the mole's brain representing each one of those tentacles. So that's a somatotopic map. When we looked at this, what we found, it was almost like, and then there was a miracle. You know that cartoon where the guy's got all the things that says, and then a miracle happens, okay? But this truly is an amazing part of the story of the vertebrate brain and the development of sensory consciousness and subjectivity. These are called the neural crest and plaque codes, okay? They're embryonic cells that arose at the dawn of the vertebrates and occur in full development only in the vertebrates. They contribute to regions of the head and neck for sensory experience, and they contribute as well to the somatic senses of touch, pain, and temperature, okay? The ectodermal placodes, so again, these are embryological. They occur mainly in vertebrates in full form, and they occur during a period of time that we think is probably around the Cambrian. These are involved with the lens of the eye, receptor cells of the nose, and hearing, the ear for hearing. So in other words, all of your basic senses are dependent upon the development of these neurobiological, evolutionary, embryological developments. And the lens of the eye is critical for forming, if we talk about vision, critical for forming the image-forming eye. Okay, if you could explain the image-forming eye, all right, if you have a representation that is in your brain, that is not experienced on the retina, is projected in the world, and the animal has a subjective experience that diverges between the first and third person representation, that is an example of subjectivity. Compared to what? Oh my God. That can't be, I didn't start till oh my God, okay. Okay, here is your neural, I started late, by the way, but anyway, okay. And everybody here knows it, I have a lot of witnesses. Okay. Okay, very quickly then. So then, these are the plaque codes, and they contribute to the lens of the eye, the smell, hearing, critical for the development of what is going to be sensory consciousness. You can see what happens here. This is a lancelet, an amphioxus. The very primitive brain, a single frontal eye, a grossly, Thurston LaCalle does beautiful work on this that shows that there is a pre-substrate for these things, but very, very crude. This animal is unlikely, or really we don't believe it has consciousness. Look what happens, though, with the advent of the neurocrest and plaque codes around the time of that craving, and here you get, in a very complex brain, you've got smell in the telencephalon. You've got, we believe, in the optic tectum is where, in the midbrain, where vision is occurring, in combination with some hindbrain. And you've got a well-differentiated tripartite brain of a telencephalon, midbrain, hindbrain. This is a revolution in consciousness. This is a revolution. And this is where we think the explanatory gaps start, and this is where we think the hard problem starts. Now, if I say that enough, will you give me a little more time or no? No? No. All right, I'm not working. This is not working. Okay. I want to read you this one part here, is that this is from Lamb's work on, beautiful work on the retina and vision. And he says that it was not until the Cambrian, beginning around 540, the animal begins to evolve image-forming eyes. So there is virtual, I think, almost proof that there's some aspect of subjectivity that evolved in the Cambrian. Okay? The theory is that sensory images began at this time, and that would be for touch, for vision, for smell, for hearing, where all of these extraceptive sensory functions came into being, and it would be with an animal, fish-like animal called Hecauxus. And therefore, the extant living representative of that is the lamprey eel. Every time I look at a lamprey on television, I go, God, look at that. Isn't that amazing, that little guy? Okay, so now we see that here is the branch point where you get an animal like Hecaichthys, Hecula more primitive, and eventually something like a lamprey eel. Isn't that adorable? That's Hecaichthys. That may be the first conscious vertebrate on Earth. At least when I look at it, that's what I think. That guy, you did it, man. Okay, I'm going to run through affect very quickly since I only have 0.1 minutes. Again, something it's like to be. Difficult to find absolute criteria. We're never going to find absolute criteria. This is always going to be an argument to debate. It's always going to be debatable. It's going to be somewhat subjective. There's always to be a consensus. They'll never find an absolute criteria for this. And it is likely to be a continuum, but there are some markers, okay? These are the origins of affective consciousness that we use as a comparative neuroanatomy. These are the usual suspects that are involved in various aspects of emotion. I won't go into these all, but we found the following, that these structures are absent in cephalochordates like Amphioxus. They don't have them. But bony fish have 23 of 25, and lampreys have 19 of 25. Good argument for affective awareness in a fish or a lamprey. For the behavioral criteria, we looked at these. We're going to hear more about these later on. Learning global, non-reflexive operant responses, behavioral trade-offs, such as cost-benefit decisions, frustration behavior, self-delivery of analgesics. We found all vertebrates show evidence of all these behaviors. The cephalochordates do not. Amphioxus do not. So now you can see the picture coming together. You've got an animal with a primitive brain who doesn't. You've got an animal with a relatively short evolutionary span has these behaviors that does. So this is our basic model. This is where it all happens. We believe in the vertebrate line with the origins of affective, interoceptive, and exteroceptive consciousness. And as we agree with everyone at this meeting that we give it to the octopus, we give it to some arthropods, probably many of them, and we give it to vertebrates. I want to finish with the following. So what does all this mean? I started out doing this work to try to find the origins of subjectivity. This is our scheme. We believe that many, many years ago, at the origins of life, so we're talking back in 3.75 billion years ago, life created some functional aspects that include embodiment, process. Consciousness is a process. It's not a thing. System, self-organization, and biological hierarchies. Not conscious, but laying down the foundations for consciousness. Then we went through a period of millions of years where we got increased rates and connectivity at the level of reflexes. Non-conscious, but once again, walking the road, walking the path. Okay? Increased neuronal specializations. Neurons began to do different things. Okay? And simple reflex arcs become chains of complexity connected neurons. Finally, this is the dawn of consciousness right here. Even though these are critical, and I would not exclude these, and indeed I don't think we get these without these, which is a critical part of understanding subjectivity, and the hard problem is that we must not exclude these. If we're going to get to the bottom of subjectivity, you must have these involved in your theory. Okay, finally, conscious animals have brains that appear to be at least 100,000 neurons. They're hierarchically arranged in unique neural-neural interactions. They create either mental images or isomorphic mental images. They create affective networks rather than isomorphic coding, and they have intention. Let me just finish with the following. I'm beginning to not like this. Okay, let me add this, because this is something that is underappreciated. We just spoke about the unique origins of subjectivity in evolution and in animals. But something else happens. Once that starts happening, the subject and object perspectives begin to diverge. What do I mean by that? Very briefly, the neuron, the subject, has no access to their own neurons. I can't see my own brain. I can only see the world, I can feel myself, but I can't see my own neurons. At the same time, the outside observer can see the neurons, but he has no access to the subjective experience of the individual. So this is sort of, when you go the other way and start building up subjectivity, all of a sudden you end up with this conundrum, the mind-body problem, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, here's our final slide, or almost final slide, penultimate. I can't believe how short this was. Penultimate, okay? I put a lot of work into this. Okay, so 3.75 billion years ago, life, don't forget it. Any theory that's going to get you up here, you got to start down here, the foundation. Everything involved with consciousness has in common life. All right, this is for animal consciousness. Whether there'll ever be anything like that Westworld show, I have no idea. But I doubt it. I doubt it. I don't think it's possible. Next, you get reflexes. Then you add on neurohierarchical complexity, 560 to 520 million years ago. We call these the special features. That's where consciousness is born and built upon these. You get resulting images and affects. These give you your 4 gaps. You add on the problem of auto and allo irreducibility, the ability to see your own neurons, etc. There you go. That gets you home without any gaps. Conclusions. By our criteria, consciousness across species, vertebrates, arthropods, and cephalopods, appears to have emerged via different, this was touched on earlier, we think it's clear there are different neurobiological mechanisms. It's diverse across species and individual brains, thus making a single neurobiological explanation unlikely, if not impossible. So when I read a paper, then the person says, that's it. That I don't buy into it. I don't believe there is such a thing that translates any single factor of neurons into subjectivity. When you build in life and reflexes, you get to these special features, but these may vary and do vary across species and within brains. But there are a number of common factors. And the explanation for consciousness and ontological subjectivity overlap, but they're not identical. If you're looking for subjectivity in a neuron, you're not going to find it. Thank you.
Okay, Todd is still working on his best-selling next book on consciousness of time. Got some valuable data here. Okay, we got time for 1 or 2 quick questions. Okay, Tyler. There you go.
So you started off with this distinction that there's a distinction between subjectivity and consciousness. And yet I never really got it. Because, I mean, during your talk, at times it was subjectivity is equivalent to primary or sensory consciousness, and at the end you had a slide, subjectivity and consciousness are ... but they don't overlap totally. So I really didn't get I didn't get a distinction there.
Okay, look, it's very, you know, that's a topic, that's a whole other hour, but basically, yes. Everybody
That was your talk.
Everybody talks about consciousness, but are they really talking about subjectivity? Consciousness involves awakeness and alertness and all these other variables. That's not subjectivity. If a person is unconscious, okay, that gets down to their brainstem and core brain functions and awakeness and sleep, and that's consciousness. Subjectivity is the hard problem. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, okay? Consciousness is about subjective. The hard problem or the explanatory gaps are really about subjectivity. Consciousness is just a much broader term. Subjectivity is sort of a sub part of that problem, but I think the most interesting.
Thank you. You talk about the origins of life, and I can't help but ask the question of the transitions. So if you have maybe autocatalytic sets at the very origin of life, where life was chemistry, had in a very limited, basic way the same properties of that referral, etc., that you were referring to, would you agree that if starting from there, you would have transitions to more complex kind of the consciousness you're describing?
No. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you're saying, but we take life as a resolvable and resolved problem. We're not interested in the origins of life, if that's what you're asking. And everything, all the animals we spoke about start with the same life, we presume, unless you believe that cephalopods came from Mars and, vertebrates came from a meteor from Jupiter, So we take life as a given, and that we take universal principles of life as a solved problem. I'm not sure that answers you, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, we should move on now. So thank you, Todd. Okay, our next speaker is Andrew Barron from Macquarie University in Sydney. You might have noticed that Australians are very well represented in this session, and indeed at the conference. No bias on the part of the organisers, I assure you. But Andrew's in the Department of Biological Sciences at Macquarie. He's done a lot of work on neuroscience, especially in insects, especially in bees. Been a specialist in bee cognition and behavior, and has recently gotten very interested in questions of consciousness. Published a very influential paper with the philosopher Colin Klein last year, making a case for consciousness in insects. His paper today is Insects Have the Capacity for Basic Awareness. So please welcome Andrew.
Okay, thank you. If I speak at that volume, you can hear me at the back? It's all right? No. If I speak at that volume, you can hear me. If I do that, is that better? Okay, that's much better. Okay. All right, thank you for inviting me to speak today. David talked about how some of us have come from philosophy to animal behavior, some from animal behavior to philosophy. I'm definitely one of those, coming from animal behavior to philosophy. I'm a comparative neuroscientist. Most of my research is on organisms like the honeybee. And then last year I teamed up with my colleague Colin Klein, and we were really thinking about what we could infer from what we're learning about insect neuroscience and what that might mean for what we could conclude about awareness in things like a bee. So what I want to do today is to summarize the arguments that Colin and I put forward and update them with some new information that we have. And the talk's really in two parts. The first part is my perspective on how the insect brain works. The second part is what I think the consequences of that might be for our thinking about consciousness and awareness in organisms like insects. Okay, that's a slide I use a lot in talks that I give. This is basically a laundry list of clever things it's been claimed that bees can do. Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with everything on this list, but what I want to emphasize is that insects are not just instinctive, behaviorally fixed, innate driven organisms. Some insects, at least, have levels of behavioral complexity that rival those of some mammals. That's despite them having a brain that is a fraction of the size of even the smallest mammals. So that's a honeybee brain. That scale bar is 1 millimeter, so we have a millimetrically scaled brain. This is a very big brain for an insect, but it's still got less than 1 million neurons. But what I want you to realize from this slide is that look at the level of internal structural complexity in this insect brain. There's a lot of different specialized modules operating together, integrated together as a highly complex structure. So the insect brain is small, but the insect brain is definitely not simple. And my research has been thinking about how the insect brain might work as a system. And a lot of my thinking in that area has been influenced by the work of Bjorn Merker, who I think gave us a really instructive conceptual model of how any autonomous behavioral system would have to operate. So Bjorn kind of laid out that if you're going to be an autonomous behaving entity, in real time you need to resolve 3 interacting domains of decision making. You need to resolve what you need, what's out there in the world that you can get, and what you've got to do to get it. And those domains are not separate, they have to interact because what's available feeds back into what you need, and also the distribution of where things are influences what you've got to do to get it. And what Bjorn emphasized is that the capacity to resolve those 3 interacting domains of decision-making localized to the structures of the vertebrate midbrain and diencephalon, not the cortex. So it's the older, more primitive parts of the vertebrate brain that Todd just talked about that give us the capacity to resolve this kind of a problem. And also in Bjorn's integrated, what he called a behavioral core control system, he emphasized the role of the tectum, which is another region that Todd talked about, as being a super hub in that network, because the tectum is an anatomical locus where the representation of space, including where the animal is located in space, has a capacity to interact with the state and the needs of the organism within the tectum. Okay, and Bjorn spoke about this system having a capacity to create a reality space, which is basically a model of the organism, a neural model of the organism in its world. And that reality space is itself the mechanism for resolving autonomous behavioral control. It's not a Cartesian theater. It itself is the mechanism that allows you to operate autonomously in your environment. And in Todd's work, Todd highlighted how this kind of autonomous organized behavior is extremely ancient in the vertebrate line. These structures we talked about of the midbrain and diencephalon go right back to the basal vertebrates. So we're looking at a behavioral control system that is at least basal to the vertebrate line. What I was thinking about was how we could possibly apply that kind of thinking to an understanding of the insect brain. So Colin and I, we were inspired by Bjorn's model. We took that model and we asked, how might this apply to a brain that is radically different than the brain of an insect? I don't want to go into too much detail about the specifics of what we proposed, but what we argued is that the totality of the insect brain is functionally analogous to what's going on with the vertebrate midbrain and diencephalon, and that we can think about the insect brain as doing exactly the same job of resolving these same 3 interacting domains of decision-making. And to summarize it, we imagine that the insect brain as a whole creates this functional representation of the state of the mobile animal in space, and that that's a solution for effective decision-making in insects. And what we did here is we color-coded, it's very much simplified, we color-coded the different key regions of the insect brain, how they might contribute to different elements that make up this reality space as it applies to the insect. Now, the neuroscience of our argument was critiqued on really 2 grounds. First of all, what did we mean by represent in something like an insect brain? And then, how did we know the insect brain is actually integrated? So I just want to quickly cover those 2 critiques. Our use of the term represent is actually quite a lightweight use of the term represent. It's very much reconcilable with how Andy Clark's been thinking about how nervous systems can represent information. We're thinking about represent in a connectivist viewpoint, that it's basically connections and connection weights that is our representation. We're not imagining an offline stored non-dynamic representation at all. It's very much an active representation as part of the system. So we think we are reconcilable with Andy Clark's perspective on representation and reconcilable with Barbara Webb's critique of what representation could be in a nervous system. I think the more nuanced, well, certainly the more challenging critique that I actually wasn't quite expecting was, is the insect brain actually integrated? And where this came from is that for a lot of people, they've had a lot of success in modeling insect behavior with explicitly non-integrated models, subsumption models, where there's explicitly no integration of the system. What I'm really pleased to say now is that we are right at the cusp of comparative neuroscience and invertebrate neuroscience moving into a connectomic level of understanding. So we have the first drafts of the first insect connectome, and the Drosophila connectome. And that's letting us answer categorically whether the insect brain is an integrated system or non-integrated system. And what's fantastic is that what's come out from this first draft of a Drosophila connectome is this diagram of information flows through the Drosophila brain. So not a bee, it's a fruit fly. 10 times smaller than a bee, but at least in terms of modules and regions, it's similar enough that we can assume information should transfer to a degree. But at least in the fruit fly, this is a model of how information flows through the fly brain to generate action. And what I want to emphasize is this is a completely integrated system. So we have the lines of sensory processing in blue, all of which feed into these two iterative and interacting premotor loop and in green and the motor loop in black. So we have a fully integrated system that is generating action commands. And if we got into the specifics and the detail and related what these regions were doing, we could actually consider exactly this model in terms of resolving the domains of the motivation of the organism, what's available in space, and what the organism needs to do to get it. So it is fair to say that the insect brain operates as an integrated structure. Now, what's also neat about this brand new connectomic data that's coming out is that in Todd's, jet lagged. In Bjorn's model of the vertebrate behavioral core control system, Bjorn emphasized the tectum as a super hub in that behavioral control system. What comes out from the Drosophila connectome is the super hub is the fan-shaped body, which is a region of the central complex. And that is the fan-shaped body here in a locust. Here's the fan-shaped body in a fruit fly. We're very literal in the insect world. It's called the fan-shaped body because it's a body that looks like a fan. What's neat about the fan-shaped body, one of the reasons I like it is absolutely bang in the anatomical center of the insect brain. We've also got reasons to believe this is probably the oldest part of the arthropod brain, and that the fan-shaped body is very highly conserved, not just within insects, but also within spiders and within crustaceans. Now, the fan-shaped body is a region that we're learning a lot about right now. And what we're learning is that it is that the functional analogy between the fan-shaped body and the tectum is really quite profound. So across the neural populations in the fan-shaped body, there is a representation of space. It does represent the position of the organism within space. It represents the location of relevant objects relative to the organism in space. And as a neurochemist, I'm excited because this is the most neuromodulated region of the insect brain. And what this suite of neuromodulators does is it changes the way in which objects are represented relative to the organism and puts a subjective weight on them according to the needs of the organism. And that neuromodulation also supports a window of selective attention, which allows the organism to place within that window the objects that it particularly needs to pay attention to or needs to orient towards. Now, we're also realizing that this feature of selective attention is a really widespread feature of the insect brain. This work is really being driven by Bruno van Swinderen, who's a colleague of mine at University of Queensland. And really, wherever we look in the higher processing regions of the insect brain, we see this phenomenon of selective attention. And the reason I raise this is the insect brain is much more than the simple sensorimotor transformation system. The processing within the insect brain is itself subjective depending on the state of the organism and what the organism is paying attention to. Okay, so what I've done is I've described my view on how the insect brain works as a behavioral control system that allows an organism like a bee to operate as a cognitive, effective agent. But what's relevant to this meeting is have I just described a mechanism, or do we have any bounds or any reason to imagine there is any level of awareness in an organism like a bee? So that's really what I want to try to get into here. And the nature of the argument I want to make really boils down to this. So Bjorn and others have argued that structures in the midbrain and the diencephalon, they don't just support this behavioral control capacity. They are also important for our basic awareness of the world. And we know that because if we interfere with the structures of the midbrain and diencephalon, we don't just interfere with behavioral control, we also interfere with our awareness and our subjective experience of the world. So there is a relationship there. We may not know the exact details of what that relationship is, but the relationship exists. And for that reason, other organisms that share this sort of behavioral control system, share this sort of brain, share this way of processing the world, we're to greater and lesser degrees reasonably comfortable with extending not just this model of behavioral control to them, but also this basic, an assumption that it might be reasonable to infer a basic capacity of awareness for organisms that have this sort of a brain. Now, what's also important for my argument is that myself and others, not everyone, believe that there are different levels to consciousness and that it is possible to have a basic form of awareness, this is something that Peter talked about, without having to also invoke the necessity for self-awareness or meta-self-awareness. So I feel that it is possible to be basically aware of things without the requirement to be self-aware. And for that reason, what we're talking about is how far could we extend, how far could we reach this capacity for basic awareness into down a phylogenetic tree of organisms that have a similar sort of brain, but we're not having to invoke a capacity for self-awareness in order to have that basic capacity for awareness. Now, some authors are, like Thomas Nagel, who's staring at me in the front row, which is really, really nerve-wracking, would be quite happy to extend this capacity for basic awareness quite a long way down the mammalian line. So in Thomas's extremely influential and highly cited paper, Thomas is quite comfortable to think of the bat as an experiential entity. It has some sort of experience, it has some sort of awareness. That's not the question phrased in the paper. The question is actually phrased, what sort of awareness does the bat have? Not, is the bat an aware organism? And Thomas was happy to extend that capacity for awareness to a bat because the bat's a mammal like we are and probably processes the world in a way that's pretty similar to the way that other mammals process the world. So we could be reasonably comfortable to imagining that capacity for awareness should extend to something like a bat. Now, if you're happy to extend awareness to a bat, the question becomes, would you also be happy to extend awareness to something like a bee? So we can make an argument for homology of brain systems and anatomical similarity of brain systems if we're extending awareness